Hello, my name is John Zamoyda. I am an attorney licensed in the state of Ohio. In addition to my private practice, I am also the Director of Law and Prosecuting Attorney for the City of Struthers. My firm, Anthony and Zamoyda, is beginning a new series that will discuss a wide range of everyday legal issues. The series is called Just the Law from A to Z, and our episodes will be posted on our website at www.anthony-zomoida.com, as well as our social media pages. If you would like to receive these episodes, I encourage you to follow us. Initially, I'd like to apologize for the production quality of this video. I am not tech savvy to say the least, and I just came up with the idea for this series. My inspiration was the case of State of Minnesota versus Derek Chauvin because I felt many people are emotionally invested in the case, and I wanted to release this video before the trial begins on March 29th. Also, I suspect very few know what exactly the state of Minnesota must prove in order to convict Derek Chauvin. In order to have an objective, well informed opinion of Derek Chauvin's guilt or innocence, you should know the rules of the game. Without knowing the rules of the game, it would be like me trying to predict which cricket team will win the championship next year when I don't know the first thing about the sport. Furthermore, I also want to stress that the purpose of our series is not to give opinions on the legal issues that we discuss or to advocate for any particular side. Instead, the sole purpose is to explain the law, whether we agree with it or not, in the simplest terms possible. For the most part, our series will focus on the law of the state of Ohio. However, like today, I will occasionally discuss high profile cases outside of the state of Ohio. As you all probably know, Derek Chauvin is on trial for allegedly causing the death of George Floyd on May 25th, 2020. But what exactly does the prosecution need to prove in order to convict Derek Chauvin? As in all crimes, Derek Chauvin is presumed innocent. The prosecution has the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that Derek Chauvin committed each and every element of the crime. The elements of a crime are each of the requirements that must be proven in order for a person to be found guilty. Reasonable doubt does not mean that you cannot have any doubt. Instead, it is doubt based upon reason and common sense after careful and impartial consideration of all the evidence. It is the kind of doubt that would make a reasonable person hesitate to act. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt, therefore, must be proof of such a convincing character that a reasonable person would not hesitate to rely and act upon it in making his or her most important decisions. Derek Chauvin is charged with 3 crimes: second degree murder, third degree murder, and second degree manslaughter. Each of these charges requires proof that Derek Chauvin's actions were both the factual and proximate cause of George Floyd's death. The prosecution will attempt to show factual causation by arguing that Derek Chauvin's actions of kneeling on George Floyd's neck for over 8 minutes were a causal factor contributing to George Floyd's death. This standard can be met even if other factors, such as George Floyd's alleged drug use and medical issues, were also contributing factors in his death. The prosecution must prove that Derek Chauvin's actions were the proximate cause of George Floyd's death. In other words, the prosecution must prove that George Floyd's death was not the direct result of some independent, intervening person's act or other factors that Derek Chauvin could not have possibly foreseen. Unlike factual causation, the prosecution should have a relatively easy time proving the proximate cause requirement. I should stress that factual causation will likely be one of the most important issues during the trial, so please don't forget this requirement. The most serious charge Derek Chauvin faces is second-degree murder. Second-degree murder is also referred to as felony murder. There are two types of second-degree murder under Minnesota law: intentional murder and unintentional murder. Derek Chauvin is charged with unintentional second-degree murder. Under Minnesota law, unintentional second-degree murder occurs when a person 1. Causes the death of another, 2. Without the intent to cause the death of the person, and 3. While committing or attempting to commit a felony offense. Fortunately for the prosecution, this crime is defined broadly in Minnesota. Felony murder allows a person whose conduct brought about an unintended death during the commission of a felony to be found guilty of murder by imputing malice when there is no specific intent to kill. The second-degree murder charge requires the prosecutor to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the death of George Floyd occurred during the commission of a predicate felony by Derek Chauvin. Not all felonies that result in death constitute felony murder. Minnesota courts have held that the predicate felony for felony murder must involve a special danger to human life. In this case, the predicate felony is third-degree assault. Third-degree assault is defined as an assault or an attempt to commit an assault that causes substantial bodily harm. Assault is defined as the intentional infliction of or attempt to inflict bodily harm upon another. In Minnesota, assault is a general intent crime. This means that to prove third-degree assault, the prosecution does not have to show that Derek Chauvin intended to cause substantial bodily harm to George Floyd. Instead, under Minnesota's unusually broad felony assault rules, the prosecution only needs to show that Derek Chauvin intended to put his knee on George Floyd's neck and that substantial bodily harm occurred as a result. Therefore, because substantial bodily harm clearly occurred, the prosecution can meet its burden for third-degree assault if it can prove that Derek Chauvin committed an assault by intentionally pressing his knee to George Floyd's neck. But remember, Derek Chauvin's attorneys only need to raise a reasonable doubt in one juror. His attorneys will likely argue that he was not the factual cause of George Floyd's death because George Floyd died from illegal drugs he consumed and or because of his underlying health issues, not as a result of Derek Chauvin's knee on George Floyd's neck. Additionally, Derek Chauvin's attorneys will likely argue that he did not commit felony assault because he is authorized by law to use reasonable force as a result of being a police officer, and his use of the knee-to-neck restraint was a permitted policy of the Minneapolis Police Department, and thus it was a reasonable use of force. Unfortunately for Derek Chauvin, Minnesota has a particularly weird form of felony murder. Of the states that still have felony murder, nearly all have adopted what is known as the merger rule or the independent felony rule. Under this rule, the underlying felony must be separate from the act that caused death. This generally means that assault cannot serve as the underlying felony for felony murder. For example, if a person sets fire to a home and accidentally kills someone, that's felony murder. By contrast, if someone punches somebody in the face and accidentally kills him or her, that's not felony murder in most states. Minnesota is just one of a few states that have rejected the felony rule. Therefore, it allows assault to serve as the underlying felony for second-degree murder. The second-degree murder charge is a way to use this quirk in Minnesota law. It is a way of seeking a conviction for second-degree murder without proving an intent to kill. In its simplest terms, all the prosecution needs to prove for second-degree murder is that Derek Chauvin assaulted George Floyd and that George Floyd died as a result of the assault. Derek Chauvin is also charged with third-degree murder. Third-degree murder is another type of unintentional murder and is often referred to as depraved mind murder. Under Minnesota law, third-degree murder occurs when a person causes the death of another by perpetrating an act imminently dangerous to others and showing a depraved mind without regard for human life. That's a lot. Essentially, this means that a person does an act that is extremely reckless as to the risk of causing death, such as driving a car into a crowd of people. There isn't much difference between second-degree murder and third-degree murder. As I already stated, the underlying felony for felony murder must pose a special danger to human life. This means the felony must pose some risk of death, which is similar to what depraved heart murder requires. The main difference between the two is another quirk under Minnesota law, because the depraved heart recklessness required for third-degree murder is determined by the jury, while the special danger to human life required for second-degree murder is determined by the judge. Additionally, second-degree murder and third-degree murder are actually punished the same. Under Minnesota law, a convicted person's sentence is primarily determined by the state's sentencing guidelines. Under these guidelines, both unintentional second-degree murder and third-degree murder have a presumptive sentence of 150 months, and both require a special jury verdict to go above 180 months. The last charge Derek Chauvin is charged with is second-degree manslaughter. Under Minnesota law, second-degree manslaughter occurs when a death occurs by a person's culpable negligence, whereby the person creates an unreasonable risk and consciously takes chances of causing death or great bodily harm. The essence of this crime is that Derek Chauvin was aware of, but disregarded a substantial risk of serious injury to George Floyd. As an example of second-degree manslaughter, there was a case in Minnesota where a defendant, with no intent to hurt anyone, fired his rifle toward a spot across the river where he had recently seen people standing and accidentally killed one of those people. He was charged and convicted. In Derek Chauvin's case, it seems obvious, in retrospect at least, that his actions created an unreasonable risk of great bodily harm to George Floyd. However, the difficulty for the prosecution will be to prove that Derek Chauvin was actually aware of that risk at the time of the incident. The assessment of Derek Chauvin's acts and beliefs depends in part on the timing of George Floyd's death. Although he was wasn't pronounced dead until a little over an hour after the officer stopped holding him down, it's possible that he died shortly after he seemed to have stopped breathing on the video. The final minutes when George Floyd was still alive and being held down are critically important. The longer Derek Chauvin kept his knee on George Floyd's neck and the weaker George Floyd's voice and movements became, the greater and more obvious the risk of life became, and the less justification Derek Chauvin could reasonably believe he had to keep forcibly holding down George Floyd. Furthermore, when George Floyd seemed to have stopped breathing, Derek Chauvin arguably violated his legal duty to administer CPR to save George Floyd's life, and thereby may have become liable for causing George Floyd's death. Even if the prosecution is able to prove all of the elements of one or more of the charges against Derek Chauvin, he is still not guilty if he has an affirmative defense. In my opinion, his primary defense will focus on whether he was the factual cause of George Floyd's death because of George Floyd's underlying health issues and use of illegal substances. Moreover, Derek Chauvin's, Derek Chauvin's act of kneeling on George Floyd's neck arguably constituted deadly force. Under Minnesota law, such force can only be used when necessary to arrest for a felony, and either the felony is an offense involving the use or threatened use of deadly force, or the officer reasonably believed the suspect would cause death or great bodily harm if his or her arrest was delayed. George Floyd's alleged counterfeit passing crime was probably only a gross misdemeanor and involved no use of force. Nor did George Floyd seem dangerous. Thus, it's highly unlikely that deadly force to arrest was justified in this case. If Derek Chauvin's actions are found to not constitute deadly force, his attorneys may also argue that his actions represented reasonable force. In other words, Derek Chauvin reasonably believed that the force used was necessary. Under Minnesota law, the prosecution must disprove beyond a reasonable doubt at least one element of any affirmative defense. Given George Floyd was handcuffed behind his back, was surrounded by 4 officers, had not attacked the officers or anyone else, steadily grew weaker, and then passed out, it seems likely the prosecution will be able to prove that the force was or became unnecessary. Furthermore, Derek Chauvin will likely argue that his actions were justifiable and consistent with the policies and practices of the Minneapolis Police Department. Derek Chauvin's attorneys will likely argue that George Floyd was resisting arrest and that the force used by Derek Chauvin was justified in order to control George Floyd. However, those regulations limited neck restraints to suspects who actively resisted. And while Derek Chauvin may have had an argument that George Floyd was at times resisting, George Floyd certainly was not resisting after he passed out. Derek Chauvin may need to testify to explain why he felt he had to hold George Floyd down for so long. I assume he will say that he followed his training and that his actions were necessary because his experience with other suspects who were under the influence of drugs taught him that things can suddenly become erratic and dangerous. The prosecution, however, has submitted a list of previous instances in which Derek Chauvin used chokeholds or similar restraints. The judge in this case ruled that the prosecution can admit only evidence from one arrest made by Derek Chauvin, during which he restrained the person by placing his knee on the person's neck while the person was on the ground. Additionally, the judge ruled that the prosecution can tell the jurors about another incident during which Derek Chauvin saw another officer place an intoxicated male in a side recovery position. Telling the jurors about these events will allow the prosecution to show that Derek Chauvin knew the proper way to restrain someone and that he has done it wrong before. To defend against this, Derek Chauvin could possibly argue that he used the same hold in the past, and because it never caused problems before, he believed it was safe to use on George Floyd. As a final point, I believe the biggest challenge that Derek Chauvin's attorneys will face is trying to move the jurors' focus off of the video and the strong emotion it generates. With that said, legal experts disagree on whether the state of Minnesota will overcome its burden of proof. I guess we'll find out soon. I'd like to thank you for watching our first installment of Just the Law from A to Z. Hopefully you have a better understanding of the rules of the game for the Derek Chauvin trial. Please be on the lookout for other upcoming videos that we feel will help you have a better understanding of the law. And if you have a legal question that you wish for us to discuss, feel free to submit your questions through our social media pages. Stay safe, everyone.